and welcome to the last of Real Deal's Tech Innovation webinar series. In this session, we'll be discussing the practicalities of aligning LP and GP data interests and why it is especially important at uncertain times like these for LPs to have access to transparent and timely data. I'm Talia Masiri, editor at Real Deals, and today I'm joined by Melissa Fraz, Managing Director and Global Head of eFront Insights at BlackRock Solutions, Alex Scott, Partner at Pantheon, Carla Finley-Dons, Director of Asset Management and ESG Business Development at KPMG, and Brad Thorley, Senior Director at Houghton Co. Hi Melissa, perhaps you could give us a brief overview of your role and how it fits into the topic we'll be discussing today.
Sure, absolutely. I recently joined BlackRock Solutions, leading up the Insight team. Insight is really working to transform the space into both data services and technology to provide the definitive front office tools for LPs. I spent the last 7 years of my career focusing on financial technology for the private markets. And prior to that, 14 years in the liquid space, also in fintech. So I'm passionate about transforming a space that is ripe for opportunity, ever evolving and growing and changing, and that's been fairly tech starved compared to other liquid investments.
Great, thank you. And we'll definitely kind of be coming back onto those kind of the tech points later on in the session. Thanks, Melissa. And Brad, perhaps you could give us a bit of an insight into what you do, and good morning to you kind of over in the US.
Yeah, good afternoon to you. I am a senior director on the private equity team at UTIMCO, which is an endowment that manages about $50 billion of assets across University of Texas and Texas A&M schools. My day job is sort of investing, fund investing, co-investing in the private equity arena. I've got a good area of passion as it relates to the development of trust between GPs and LPs, data transparency, and methodologies around data analytics associated with that level of transparency.
Sure. So again, lots in data there, and kind of looking forward to hearing your insights a bit later on. Alex, you're also kind of within the LP space at Pantheon. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and your role there?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a partner on Pantheon's European investment team. Been with Pantheon for 15 years now. Pantheon's a fund of funds private equity advisor across private equity and infrastructure, looking after about $50 billion. And I've got a couple of different roles at Pantheon. I'm also co-chair of our ESG committee, and I've also got involved in business process projects around company data as well.
Great. And yeah, again, we'll kind of be covering a lot on quite a bit on ESG a bit later on too, so look forward to hearing your views. And last but not least, we've got Carla Finley-Dons from KPMG. Hi, Carla.
Hi there. So I'm a business director at KPMG. I look after asset management and ESG. Prior to joining KPMG, I was at Goldman Sachs Asset Management for over 10 years, and I used to sit on the UN PRA Council for advisory for ESG. I also sat on various ESMA councils, again looking at the asset management industry, and I was also the Chief Global Regulatory Market Strategist at Brown Brothers Harriman, really working with C-suite to think about where the asset management business is going, where to look at strategy, and then specifically now thinking about how data really impacts different asset classes and how to sort of level up the playing field.
Definitely great. Thank you, Carla. Okay, so as we've seen, I'm very lucky to be joined by such an experienced and diverse group of panelists today. So we will be getting into discussion now, but please, if you do have any questions, please do send them through, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end. So without further ado, let's get started. So I think to begin, I think it's important to get an understanding of the current LP-GP relationship around data. So Alex, perhaps you could start us off. What is the current state of that relationship?
Yeah, I'd say, look, it's an improving one. What we see now is completely different to what we saw 5 or 10 years ago. So starting on a positive note, really. I think, look, if you look at managers' responses to COVID, disclosure's been pretty good around that. In terms of due diligence, you get better disclosures than we've ever had before in data rooms when you're doing due diligence. Technical disclosures are starting to get better. So things like transaction fees are at least a thing now that, you can choose to disclose or not disclose, whereas no one paid any attention, 5 years ago. Similarly, disclosures on the impact of fund facilities on fund performance, for instance, that is a thing now when it wasn't before. So it's improving, but it's got a long way to go. And I think just moving above just those technical disclosures, if you look at the bigger picture, there are significant challenges. If you look at company data, for instance, I think most LPs would expect to be able to look through to the company level on an aggregate basis across their portfolio and see what's going on. But if you look at things like company financial reporting, revenue and earnings, I think many participants are surprised when they actually start looking into that and realize that if you're looking at a globally diversified portfolio of private equity and venture assets, you're very lucky to get your coverage of revenue and earnings numbers up to around 60-70% from just the statutory reporting, let alone getting stuff on a quarterly basis, which is what you'd expect in the public markets. There's big gaps in the provision of static data, entry and exit data. For instance, who did they buy the company from? Who did they sell it to? What were the financial multiples at those points in time? Now, they may be available, but they're not really available in a structured way. They'll be in memos somewhere or an email. So all those are kind of individual challenges around company data, for instance. And then the huge challenge for pension funds or participants in the market like us is the ability to aggregate that data, because unless you've got high percentage coverage, any analysis or summaries that you can provide are going to be limited. So you not only need managers reporting to high standards, you need almost all of them doing it to a high standard, and that is a real challenge.
Yeah,
technology
definitely
can help us with this, but technology is kind of just a utility, really. Actually, you need the people, the process, and the data behind that sorted out first. And I think those are all the challenges that we're really grappling with in conjunction internally and with our GPs as well.
Sure. And I think that's something that many investors will be able to sympathise with. I think that kind of lack of alignment there and that lack of standardisation within this asset class is something that people tend to struggle with when you're coming to kind of get all the details on a company. And Brad, is that something you agree with? Kind of, we've seen improvement over the last 5 to 10 years, but there's still some way to go.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. I mean, I think 10 years ago, the quarterly information was limited. If it was available, it lived in a PDF somewhere. It was difficult to aggregate that data, or nearly impossible to aggregate it. I also, I think that the level of the availability of data in the time of due diligence is about the same. It's a little bit better now than it was then. I don't think it was necessarily too flawed, say a decade ago or even 5 years ago. It has improved slightly, and that's helpful. But when you start to do analysis around your portfolio, that data is quite stale, right? They raise every 4 years. You're comparing apples and oranges on a time standpoint. And so what I've seen in the market is a much higher degree of receptivity to sort of data transparency on a quarterly basis in a system where I think Alex is right, 60% of revenue and EBITDA numbers are kind of what we're seeing out of our buyout portfolio in terms of aggregating the company level financials, and that's far better than zero, but a long way to go. And I think that most GPs now that we speak to, once we describe what we're doing with the data, its purpose, who's going to see it, the data security around that data, most GPs now are receptive to the idea of filling out a template and put it into a system. And I think that pendulum has swung, and now it's about continuing that level of trust and continuing to push the envelope a little bit with those that might have worry about that level of transparency on a systematic basis.
Sure.
So I'm really hopeful. I think it's gone a long way. There's more to go, and there's certain strategies within private equity that are either more or less receptive to it. But my take is that that it's been a great time period, particularly the last 5 years.
Sure. And Brad, would you say kind of that moving of the pendulum has come due to maybe pressures from LPs kind of seeking greater kind of more holistic data content, or is it something that the GPs would have done anyway?
Well, I can speak, from both sides. I suppose the LP side is a lot of, asking of information, asking for the systems, sometimes even putting it in the LPA, prior to close. But from the GP's perspective, my suspicion is that they are incentivized to do this, that there's fewer phone calls, there's fewer questions. You've got times of, say, a global pandemic when the line of questioning, the level of fear rises, and so these questions start happening. How much is on the line of credit? What portion of the portfolio is experiencing, COVID-related demand or lack thereof? And so, if the data is already there, these questions are fewer, and so it sort of helps them, focus on what they really should be focusing on, which is the management of the portfolio. So yeah, I think it's both. I think the LPs are asking for it, and the GPs are seeing, particularly in times like today, are seeing the benefit of it, and so they're sort of getting on board.
Definitely. Great. Thanks, Brad. And Carla, is this something that you agree with as well? Kind of what improvement have you seen in kind of the state of the LP-GP relationship when it comes to data, and what has changed?
Yeah, so I actually think moving away from the LP-GP relationship, what we really need to think about is who the recipient beneficiaries are. And when we think about any asset class and market, when an asset class is going through a maturity curve, there tends to be two drivers, right? One is on the client side, so it's investor demand. Yeah. And then the second change is often regulatory driven. When we're in an investor demand phase we are now, exactly to Brad's point, it's going to be that clients and are making those demands of their GPs to make sure they're getting enough data and information. They're going to start to recognize, wait a minute, I should be spending my time doing my day job. We could automate a lot of this, and we could lend more transparency that not only shows us in a competitive light, but also cuts down our need for people power in order to answer the queries. But going down a step down the chain, Alex mentioned pension schemes. Pension schemes are a highly regulated entity. And as they start to go into new asset classes, such as PE, their demands are going to be at the mature end. They want transparency. They need to be able to justify decision-making to their board of trustees, to the regulators. So that goes back to sort of regulatory as well as client demand to further mature the industry. So it's not just a question of what's the relationship between a GP and LP. The real driver I see to mature that relationship actually comes from the underlying investors themselves, comes from the regulator. And it's usually the clients and the investors that are the first to make the demand, and the regulators often follow in order to get standardization. But the more the market matures and the more new investor types come into the market, especially regulated entities, it's really going to push the bar to force GPs, LPs to work in the best way possible. And the best way possible is always going to be transparency, standardization, and information sharing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I guess what you say in terms of the pension funds perhaps being more mature in terms of how they're regulated and their data standardization is in a sense making the LP kind of perhaps more active and pushing GPs to kind of provide a more standardized or kind of more data for them to analyze. Okay, and Melissa, from your perspective, what is the current state of data in the alternative asset class?
Yeah, I would agree with what a lot of what Alex, Brad, and Carla had said. We see that access to data, irrespective of what form it takes, whether it's formal reporting, ad hoc requests via the templates that Brad mentioned, or verbal communications, is ultimately the foundations of the relationship and therefore the trust. So I don't believe that fundamentally there are issues of mistrust between LPs and GPs. But as Alex touched on, we continue to see clients on our side struggle with the lack of transparency, especially at the look-through analysis level. And therefore, that in and of itself creates continued friction between all market participants, especially GPs and LPs. And, you know, having said that, Alex and Brad both mentioned it has improved from 5 to 10 years ago. You know, when I made the transition from liquid to private markets, you know, it was shocking, the level of transparency. And so that has certainly shifted, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And we believe that as competition to invest with the top quartile fund managers continues to increase, and Carla just mentioned, investor demand increases, collectively, we need to ensure that the same level of information and data transparency is present, no matter how, you know, GP friendly LPs want to remain. And, you know, the start of the governance will be your LPA, but we should push beyond what is required to what really will continue to provide investor confidence and therefore increase allocations to the asset class, which is good for all parties in the market.
Definitely. It's a private asset class that we need to be more transparent, clearly, to be able to kind of allow more movement, allow more kind of knowledge to be shared and more data to be shared. So clearly, this brings us on nicely. Clearly, kind of the data landscape within private equity has matured and it is improving, but as we've established, there still are some data deficiencies. And especially in times like these where it's kind of quite uncertain in the market. Perhaps, Brad, you could start us off with a bit on kind of the SEC warnings, for example, kind of focusing around kind of communications around fees that may be negative. Kind of how they changed your views on data deficiencies and how we should approach data.
Yeah, sure. So the SEC, I think, warning that you're referring to has to do with sort of fee verification. You know, perhaps a suggestion that there'll be a crackdown on, you know, how much discretion GPs have on fee reporting. You know, it's not exactly a new topic, but it marks, you know, yet another emphasis on a broader sort of, you know, topic du jour that a lot of LPs have from time to time as it relates to fees. And by the way, it tends to sort of coordinate when markets get a little volatile, when that level of fear and that level of questioning on the portfolio and how it's behaving rises. But as it relates to fees, same idea. What are we paying for in order to produce this level of alpha in the portfolio or whatever? So in order to get, you know, sort of transparency and consistency, there needs to be consistency in reporting as relates to fees, and it's easier said than done. There's a lot of complexities associated with, you know, fee offsets and, you know, carry calculations and so forth. And so, you know, the further we can push the industry to sort of standardize reporting, the easier it is for LPs to sort of answer the question about, you know, what we're being paid. I think that from an LP's perspective, we deserve to know what we're paying to our managers, and I truly think that our managers are not trying to hide the ball. There's just the complexity in the type of reporting, and so you know, like I said, the more systematic we can get, probably the better it is. Can't let perfect get in the way of good as it relates to that, and so you know, we can continually encourage our managers to sort of, you know, there's a bunch of different templates out there, but to have, you know, to establish some form of consistency in reporting, and to do that either, you know, through a data portal, which is sort of the holy grail, and until then, you know, in advisory committees and other levels of transparency that they have with their LPs.
Yeah.
And so you know, it's a little bit more of the same, and it takes every once in a while, it takes a little bit of extra emphasis or a headline or you know, something to sort of encourage the focus again. Because if it's not measured, if it's not addressed, then it tends to fall on the wayside.
Definitely. And are there any particular areas in which the kind of a number of GPs that are working with kind of types of data that they're not giving you, or types that you have to kind of chase up on, that's not a standard provision?
I mean, yes, absolutely. There's lots of information that we're not getting. It tends to be, we get, more transparency on fee reporting or other areas on managers that are larger. Right? They've got more resources. I get it. They got more resources. They've got a bigger accounting team. They've got bigger IR groups, and they can systematically address this issue. Smaller managers have a tougher time. There's less resources to get to it. So, as managers get larger, as fund sizes get larger, we encourage squeeze more juice out of our management fee, get more resources associated with the level of to provide the level of transparency and a systematic approach to divulging what their, in this case, the fees are. But it's not just fees; it's other portfolio metrics that Alice was kind of mentioning earlier.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting, thank you. And Carla, what do you think needs to be done to be able to drive this greater transparency? As Brad mentioned, kind of the larger funds have their IR arms, they have a kind of more developed business teams to be able to provide that data, but then the smaller funds may struggle there. Should we be making excuses for the smaller funds?
Absolutely not. And the reason I say that is that when it's very easy to become siloed within your own asset class. You know your own standards, you know common practice, that it's really usual with your relationships to rely on verbal assurances or verbal receipt of information. But when you're the investor, whether that's an asset management level or you're the investor, like we mentioned pension schemes earlier, you're looking at a multi-asset class portfolio. And when you see certain standards arrived at in other areas of your portfolio, so let's think about the derivatives market, where you're able to get standardized reporting, where you don't rely on verbal confirmation, you have something which is auditable, something that can be put in a board report. When you have transparency of research fees, which MiFID obviously brought in terms of fee unbundling, if your advisor, whether that be an asset manager or your CIO, is saying, let's get into the PE market, or we can see real growth there, this is the sort of asset class we should be putting as part of our portfolio construction, those standards are then driving the whether or not you can even enter the asset class. Because when you're the investor, you're wanting to be able to sort of compare apples with apples instead of apples with kumquats. And secondly, you are wanting to be able to justify your decision making so that you invested in A because you got a certain amount of information, you invested in B because you were able to get the same type of information irrespective of asset class type. Whereas if you have a chasm of disparity between that, it's very hard for you as a regulated entity to justify where the decision making on a fiduciary capacity and duty of care. So I think irrespective of where your place is within the PE market, there needs to be a recognition that you're not being compared just with your other PE peers. You're being compared with other asset classes. We've seen a real push for clients to go into PE. It's an incredibly attractive space to be in, but they're going to come in with a whole bunch of asks. They're going to come in with expected standards that they've lived with for 5 to 10 years in other asset classes that they think is very normal. And if the industry doesn't want to do, and what PE doesn't want to do, is in any way bar any of those investors by the lack of transparency and data. I think the other point to raise, and I know we're speaking about it a little later, is on the ESG side. Obviously, again, that's a regulatory driver. If you're a PE fund and you fall within the EU disclosure rules, again, it's the regulator who is forcing information to be disseminated from the private equity companies. And again, if you want that to be a healthy asset class, if you want to attract investors see PE as one of the biggest areas for ESG investment and growth. It makes them satisfy their own regulatory requirements. It's nothing but a win-win, but that can only happen if at the start of the chain, we have data, information that's not just part of a relationship basis, but is up to the standard of transparency, standardization, and auditable.
Definitely, really well said there, Carla. Thank you. And I completely agree. It kind of becomes a reputational issue as well, in a sense, when you've got new investors coming into the asset class, and they're able to draw those comparisons with other investments other areas that they're invested in. The discrepancies and the deficiencies, I guess, are highlighted even more so when it comes to data within private equity. And Alex, is that something you're seeing also, perhaps from an EMEA perspective as well? Kind of what are the deficiencies that you're seeing within private equity?
I thought Carla's comments were very interesting, because I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, the regulator hasn't been as prescriptive in the private equity arena, and has largely left it alone until recent years, compared to other asset classes. So you haven't got that unifying force of the regulator telling you to do things. And it's still a very fragmented, boutique-y industry as well, notwithstanding the fact that there's a couple of kind of big institutions sitting at the top of the pyramid. It's still pretty much a boutique industry. I think, look, we face additional challenges as well. I mean, we've got things, a lack of if you think about the infrastructure asset class, you've got a huge variety of assets in there, everything from wind, solar to PFI projects. How do you what are the metrics you use to report and evaluate on those and aggregate data? So those are extra layers of challenge that we are getting, basically. Mm-hmm. And all this, as we grow and as pension funds expand into other asset classes as well, all participants in this industry are facing the challenge of more complexity and the need for wider varieties of data. Meanwhile, still trying to play catch up with where we're supposed to be now and where we're not. So it's really interesting to see how institutions are going to deal with this, because, as you say, you've now got pension funds playing a bigger role, and you've got sort of insurance companies from Germany and maybe Korea, for instance, where they've got tough regulatory requirements coming into this market, and actually increasing demands massively and putting pressure on all participants to raise their game and improve the standardization and speed of provision of data. And I think the one thing we've not touched on so far is the speed of provision of data, because, of course, in private equity or private markets, there is a natural reporting lag that's built in even before a pension fund or an organisation like Pantheon gets the chance to even start aggregating it. So there are these huge lags as well, which are challenges and not always well understood maybe by regulators or new participants to the industry. Yeah,
definitely. And Alex, why do you think the regulator maybe hasn't been as heavy-handed or hasn't kind of enforced any particular requirements on the asset class?
Well, I think, look, until even now, it's still probably only 4 to 5% of the global institutional asset mix. 10 years ago, maybe it was 2%. So it's been a relatively small minority concern, and the participants in that market to date have generally felt confident in implementing through an LPA a relationship between them and a GP, and it's been largely self-managed, really. And custom has played a role. It is relied on people with existing experience and knowledge, but actually now the industry has massively grown. There's more and more people coming into it with sort of different views about how things should be done or what standards should look like. And I think the regulator is paying attention to it. I mean, the thing is, there are deficiencies, I guess, in the limited partnership agreement arrangement. The lawyers can be kind of prescriptive and list 15 different items that the fund would be responsible for paying, but there's still a hell of a lot of ambiguities when you think of the thousands of line items that a fund's going to pass through its account each year. And in some ways, I've got sympathy for the firms that have maybe $2,000 has been recharged on the wrong account, because this is all hugely complex. But it needs to be addressed.
Yeah,
I just chip in there. Mm-hmm. Because I think what's going to be interesting in the regulatory landscape is instead of where you've seen in the derivative space, for instance, that the regulator has looked wholesale at how can we regulate and transform the derivatives industry, and they've really done a belt and braces approach. I think the regulatory fire that PE is going to start to feel is an infrastructure, is going to be not by the regulator saying we're now going to set up a whole bunch of private equity regulations. Instead, it will be by osmosis of those wanting to enter the market. So for instance, I think ESG is going to be an absolute game changer. We've got a whole bunch of clients and entities globally who have both regulatory and commercial imperatives to start showing investors, showing their customer base, and showing their regulator that they're adhering to, you know, carbon offsetting or to certain environmental investments. So then they're stuck because they look out the landscape and say, well, it's going to be difficult for me to reach the numbers I have to in terms of exposure in other asset classes. One of the most attractive ways for me to achieve this ESG exposure and be able to go and tell my regulator, tell my investors, is through infrastructure. So they will seek to go into infrastructure, and that's either go, you know, pay into an infrastructure fund, or that's going to be direct relationship investment. But for them to do that and to then justify to the outside world, and more importantly, report to their regulator that that particular infrastructure deal had the relevant ESG criteria to satisfy their requirements, they're going to force the infrastructure deal to make sure they have data, to make sure they report, to make sure, and Alex mentioned about time lag, that we're not waiting a year between data updates, we're actually getting them in real time so we don't fall out of compliance. So if you're sort of stuck at the investor level, being told either for a commercial reason or a regulatory reason that you have to have ESG exposure, you're looking for it in the market, and one of the natural places feels like PE or infrastructure, you then have put that onus, which it falls upon yourself, back on to the deal, as it were, so that data aligns. So I think that it's going to be regulatory impacts that way, and it's going to be, you know, per sort of per type of PE arrangement and particular different, you know, certain, you know, energy investments, for instance, that are going to become more sophisticated quicker, because I think there's going to be, as I say, there's real investor demand, and investors are desperately looking out for how can they show their ESG credentials. And one of the first things we always get asked, in sort of my role, is where do you sit on the PE side? What do you see in infrastructure? What's going out on the market? Because that's a kind of natural place to land.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess those areas where reporting is quicker and there isn't that much of a lag and it's more standardized will hopefully act as a catalyst for the rest of the asset class to kind of keep up and catch up with that. Okay, and then maybe we could turn to looking at solutions. We've established that we all kind of agree there is some need for some sort of standardization when it comes to data in private equity. So Melissa, perhaps you could start us off on this one in terms of how do you ensure that there's kind of that LPs can have access to timely data, especially in order to assess GP performance?
Sure. So, you know, we've talked about it a few times over the last 5 to 10 years. You know, the evolution and transformation of the private markets has been quite rapid, but still there remains a large gap. And the demands for more technology and greater depth of data continue to rise every year as allocations to private markets continue to rise. And going back to Carla's comments, you know, if private markets are going to continue to attract new money from more traditional investors, it's vital that these investors can compare opportunities on a like-for-like basis. And, you know, whether it's, you know, we talked a little bit about the SEC warnings and Brad's comments, whether it's the SEC or the FCA firing kind of warning shots, so to speak, the more aligned the public and private markets become in terms of regulation, the more accessible they will become. Now, obviously, there's a cost to that, and I think everybody agrees that private markets are private for a reason, and there's advantages to that. But aligning them closer together will benefit all market participants. And what we're focused on, you know, at BlackRock Solutions is really how do we combine the right data and analytical tools to allow the transparent flow between GPs and LPs. In an efficient manner. And, you know, we've taken that a step further and extended it to helping LPs understand risk and evaluate performance across their public and private markets investments with greater clarity, precision, and efficiency with the Aladdin product suite and whole portfolio view. And from a technology standpoint, obviously there's a lot of players in this space, and all three, Alex, Brad, and Carla, all mentioned there's also industry bodies outside of regulatory, and ILPA being one, Invest Europe being another, that have responded with things like the ILPA fee template and the Portco template. Invest Europe issued ESG guidelines a couple of years ago that we'll talk about ESG in a little bit, and more. And while these frameworks, in my view, haven't been widely adopted, the sentiment and willingness to move in that direction appears to be there. And that's what, I think we collectively, we as an industry, need to work towards. And data, the concern from the GPs around what's going, what are they doing with the data? And, we need to understand it. We need to give the right color and context. I think the message to GPs would be data should be complementary to the human-to-human relationship that will always be there and should be there. And data is there to provide the right context and orient the conversation so that earlier on, Brad touched on it, data should help identify the top areas of concern. So the conversation between GPs and LPs, especially in uncertain market environments like we face ourselves today, can be focused and effective. And in particular for GPs, it allows managers to be proactive in field queries by their LPs in a timely fashion. And so we view transparency and regulatory changes as they're intended to improve the industry and bring it more in line with traditional investments while still maintaining the nature of what makes private markets an attractive space to be in and maintain higher returns and the risk profile that it has.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree, I guess kind of as we move forward, we do need that combination of kind of the data via a technology tool or a solution alongside kind of the human-to-human interaction.
Yep. And one thing I would add for the technology that given that you just mentioned it is, having access to quality private markets data is critical and important, but it also has to be actionable, meaning that you have to have the means and the ability to harness it. And that is becoming a must-have for LPs seeking superior returns. So it's not, they both have to go hand in hand. It's access to the data and the ability to understand that data, which goes to standardization and other alternative data sets like ESG, and being able to embrace kind of acquiring, analyzing, and understanding the ever-growing universe of data that will become available. And I think that's an important point, is it's not just the advances in technology, it's also access to the data and putting those two together, which is critical.
Yeah, definitely. And Brad and Alex, I saw you both nodding there. So I'm interested in kind of hearing from your perspective, what, if any types of information technology that you've been using to access data, and if so, or if you haven't, kind of what would you like to see on a data platform, kind of in terms of sharing GP information?
I've got to say, actually, it's a mark of how kind of archaic private equity processes and data provision are, that for us, it's still a very labor intensive business. So we've got 15 to 20 people in our business focused on fund valuation and verification and collecting the company data and getting it in our systems. And on top of that, at the start of the year, we started using eFront as well to expand, not to replace that resource, but to expand the bandwidth we have available to us to meet those I guess speed requirements at the end of the quarter to process this data, because you've got these bottlenecks with the reports all coming in at once. Is also helpful for business continuity as well. But again, that's about people mainly. So again, this isn't technology. You're still having to throw lots of people at conforming the data and making these processes work, because your data is not coming from just one standard document. There's multiple sources. Again, it's also a staff retention tool as well, because actually we can get people inside our firm to work on higher order, more interesting tasks. such as enriching the data from other sources, which are going to be a bit more unstructured, like advisory board packs, for instance, or due diligence data rooms. So again, for us, it's still very much a people challenge, but we are very much focused on the technology side of it as well. But as Melissa said, the data is absolutely key. You can't just get technology in to solve this. Technology is going to be worthless without getting decent data, and it's still very labor intensive.
Yeah, it's definitely still a kind of very manual process in a sense when it comes to kind of people using technology to be able to achieve, to kind of collate that data, but we're not quite there yet. Do you think we'll ever get to a point where the collection of data is almost real time? Do you think we'll be able to kind of speed up the process?
Probably not before I retire, but it's going to get better. And the more managers that conform to a standard, and then investors like Pantheon or pension funds or data providers like eFront are going to have an easier job of aggregating the data. And it should become less labour intensive. But I think that's going to be a gradual change unless there is something overnight that captures LP and GP imaginations and everyone signs up to it. And we get this lovely standardised reporting flowing through you'd expect if you're invested in an equity fund or a hedge fund.
If only. Well, hopefully before we all retire, but we'll see. And Brad, what about yourself at UTIMCO? How are you aggregating data? What are the challenges?
So, this probably goes without saying, but as an asset allocator, we have essentially insatiable demand to understand risk-adjusted returns. And I can tell you that if you're looking at managers or a fund or a strategy in its silo, that is darn near impossible to achieve. And so, importance of aggregated data that is it. That is the game. It's aggregation and its ability to look at it in its totality and make comparisons to what is happening versus what is normal, or what is happening versus history, and try to project risk-adjusted returns in the future. With that said, we use eFront as well for a data gathering tool. We think they do a good job of extracting information from the funds, asset level information of the funds, company level information from the funds. We can aggregate it and slice up that information in the portfolio, point-to-point IRRs, whatever it may be. We can do that pretty well in their system. But I think to Alex's point, we've got other systems as well that help augment that, to take some of the analytics to sort of a different level. Things that can't be done in Excel. And it's bringing in information on public market indexes and comparing it to private market behavior. It's trying to really decipher the difference between alpha and beta splits amongst different strategies and how that sort of performs. It can't be done without data, clearly, and it can't be done without the ability to aggregate that data. Any manager individually looks great on paper, right? But until you have the ability to sort of combine that with others, you really can't get a good understanding of what risk-adjusted return really means in private equity. And I think to Carla's point earlier, the level of transparency is important because we can make a better decision about the overall allocation to private equity, whether that be on the fee side or the way the portfolio is behaving. And that alone should be incentive for the GP community to continue to work together to get to a more systematic approach to the data transparency and the aggregation, and allowing that aggregation of the data. And the way I say it to most GPs is, I bet you that the risk officer at funds like mine think that the private equity portfolio is levered more than it really is. You're incentivized for the transparency. There's no fear in truth. And so the faster we can get the industry to sort of move towards, the eFronts of the world and their peers, the better it is for the overall private equity industry in its totality.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm actually quite surprised we've got this far in the conversation without mentioning COVID and the pandemic. But I'm going to have to ask, maybe to yourself, Brad and Alex, in terms of aggregating data and kind of getting more information on funds. How has that changed during this time, during lockdown? Has it been harder? Has it been easier to gain access to information?
I mean, I'll start. I think that last time you had this kind of level of uncertainty in the market was probably the GFC. And so we're light years ahead of the level of data transparency that we are now. We kind of touched on that. I'd say that the level of communication between LPs and GPs is heightened now. I mean, there's more phone calls, there's more COVID updates, there's more, our portfolios, red light, yellow light, green light, kind of updates on the overall portfolio. And it is times like now when you realize how little data you might actually have. I mean, so we talked earlier about 60 or 70% of revenue numbers coming in, or whatever the metrics are. For us, we realized how little we knew about the line of credits that were being applied to fund level leverage, and where the susceptibilities were there. We saw, I think we here saw an increase in capital calls in March and April, and it was a little perplexing based on the idea that no deals were getting done, but it paid down the lines of credit. Point being, you find new areas in times like now in COVID or other market disruptors. You find areas that you sort of lack in terms of data understanding of the data, and so on one hand, the GPs are much more open book, and they're trying hard to have as many levels of communication with GPs as they can. But the flip side is we realized in our systems that we have a lack of information, and it was something that was maybe sort of hard to project or predict. But not many people thought that the level of capital calls or the paying down of line of credit would be sort of the topic of March 2020.
Yeah.
2020. But by and large, it's better than other time periods when fear sort of is rampant. But again, there's more room to go.
Definitely really interesting there, and kind of hopefully this time bring some good and bring some kind of awareness and shine that light on what we're missing, and kind of push it forward, I guess. Okay, now I'm keen to get on to the topic that's all close to our hearts and discuss a bit more on ESG. So clearly, kind of beyond the core fund and asset financials, maybe Carly could start us off on this. Kind of have standards for reporting ESG data improved across the industry? Clearly, it's something that we're more aware of and there's more discussion around now. But what kind of lie behind all the talk?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the worst thing that PE and infrastructure and sort of other assets within this asset class could see ESG as is either as a tick box exercise or as a regulatory burden that they have to bear. ESG is essentially a data game, and more importantly, PE and specifically infrastructure are in the sweetest spot to make this a humongous industry-changing commercial opportunity. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, we've got the investors who have humongous imperative, both regulatory and from a retail perspective, to get ESG exposure. They then look out into the market and say, okay, so how do I achieve my ESG exposure? If they look to the equity markets, then equity markets have a couple of challenges. The first one is the lack of standardization, and the EU disclosure rules is going to level the playing field a little bit. However, there's also a lot of greenwashing going on, that you try and invest in a company that a ratings agency, an S&P and Moody's, MSCI, gives the green light and says, yes, it's ESG compatible, when actually half the things you care about as a company are missed out the report, or they fail to mention, and they really skew and greenwash their reporting in order to meet the ESG requirements.
Yeah.
The second issue is the disparity between agencies themselves. So S&P have got their own methodology, MSCI have got a different methodology. So you could be looking to invest in the exact same equity and get a false and a negative on the ESG score. Look to an infrastructure deal, and Melissa mentioned this earlier, the word that's been used a lot in this call is trust. And the other concept that is lacking in other areas, the market, derivatives, equities, etc., is one-on-one connectivity. If you want to achieve your ESG target and not fall down the reputational and exposure risk that currently the lack of standardization and greenwashing that other asset classes hold, you can look to somewhere like infrastructure, where you can speak one-on-one with the individuals who are actually responsible for that infrastructure deal. The amount of information you can get, whilst it may feel like it's less, because you're able to really dig in the weeds more on that deal, on that wind farm that's getting built, you can do so much more due diligence. It's a lot more labor intensive, and that can be frustrating. But the advantages against other asset classes are really the commercial imperative here, that the asset class of PE should really see ESG not as something to either avoid or to be burdened with, where they have to tick some boxes, make sure the disclosures are made in prospectuses and retain clients. Instead, they should be seeing it as the points that may be seen as a weakness in other areas. The fact that there's, I'm completely contradicting myself here, the fact that you're looking at verbal reliance, the fact that it's very human intensive, the fact that you have to get on phone calls to get information, that's your advantage here. That's going to get more investors into the asset class who wouldn't go in before, because they've now got a new driver to find the right ESG exposure. And the best way to get trust on the ESG exposure is through something like a PE relationship. So I think that is where we should think is not just about standardization, but the advantages of non-standardization, the advantages that a private market has that other non-private markets don't have. And that's, I think, where the commercial imperative comes from.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point there, Carla, especially kind of as positioning private equity's relationship with ESG as a selling point for the asset class, and a reason for investors to look towards infrastructure and private equity and this kind of asset class.
Well, if you think about it, if you're looking at equity, what's the likelihood that you're able to phone up, a FTSE 100 company, talk about how they're actually drilling into a piece of earth and ask what kind of drill they're using, or what their financing mix for it, or how many people do they have on their team? That's the kind of data that you could get in a private transaction that you're never going to be able to get in the big public markets. And then, as I say, the greenwashing piece is you're very limited with what information you can get. And without that one-on-one contact to probe, that's where the reputational risk comes in. You're unable to ungreenwash the information you're receiving. The private markets don't have that challenge so much.
Yeah, definitely. Really interesting there. And Alex, is that something you agree with? Are investors kind of more drawn to private equity, or do you think it could be a selling point for the asset class, kind of this link with ESG?
Yeah, Sean, just to expand on Carla's point, if you think about the equities market, 99.9999% of trades are just people selling shares to one another. They're second-hand trades. They're not actually meaningfully diverting flows of capital into anything useful, whereas actually in private markets, you've got the chance to fund new projects, make transactions happen that otherwise would not happen. So I think if you think about private equity being, say, 5% of the asset mix, it's probably 50% of the opportunity to actually have an impact somewhere. So that I think really encapsulates the opportunity Carla was talking about, whereas if private equity can grab that, it can really benefit from additional capital inflows. But again, Carla touched on the point about people are stumbling along here. There's some greenwashing going on. If you talk about ESG in private markets, no one's quite sure, is it an impact fund? Are you actually taking on more risk? Or is it just you're avoiding bad things? What is it you're doing? And the whole thing gets blurred into a kind of a big mush. And you've got SDGs as well that have come along. Quite nice, colourful post-its you can stick against a company to indicate what kind of pleasant activity it's involved in. But actually, that's dragged it away from the original meaning of the SDGs, which was to meet one of 168 development targets behind it. well, if you're not measuring those, you shouldn't really be using the SDGs. So, you know, any new initiative does tend to get a bit muddied by the lack of a clear taxonomy in the industry. And then, of course, that feeds into the data. Is it what data do you need? And part of the problem is there are some, I guess, absolute ethical imperatives behind ESG, but actually quite a large parts of ESG are just subjective. What matters to, you know, most people are more worried about what happens in their locally or affects their reputation locally than maybe what happens globally, and that's maybe not such an ethical approach to take. Surely we should be taking a universal approach to ESG wherever it is in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And Melissa, do you have any views here in terms of kind of maybe from your perspective, how keen are GPs to share their ESG efforts and kind of their data around that with their investors?
Yeah, so I mean, to take a step back, I agree with Carla that typically ESG has been seen as kind of a tick the box exercise historically, in a risk mitigation exercise rather than an alpha generation exercise. We see indications that a shift is occurring and more LPs are looking at it for an alpha, particularly in Europe. No offense, Brad, but the US is definitely lagging in this area. Generally, you know, we find that sustainability data in the private market spans a spectrum from identifying investment opportunities at the asset level. So that's on the GP side. And then integrating risk at the portfolio level on the LP side. And as LPs increasingly prioritize ESG factors, there's a growing demand for GPs to produce reports and analysis that can demonstrate to investors their commitment to ESG. You know, how willing GPs are, I think it goes back to, you know, GPs are looking to identify opportunities within their portfolio to capitalize on alpha, differentiate themselves in the market. And this is one tool that can allow them to differentiate themselves in the market, support commitments to responsible investments, even if they're not, you know, an impact fund manager. When fundraising, you know, especially as generationally, the younger generation does care more about the social impact and ESG factors. And so as money moves from baby boomers to Generation Z and Y and whatever we are at now, you know, that transfer of wealth will start creating that requirement for GPs to really, one, pay more attention to it, and two, have proper reporting around it. And today, I think, you know, it really is the transfer of information from GPs or to LPs is, to Carla's point, the phone call to get the information, and that kind of creates this private network, if you will, that isn't capable of happening in the public space. You're not going to pick up the phone and, you know, call a listed company and ask them about their ESG factors. Having said that, the challenge for LPs is still going to be similar standards, that there's no standardization. You know, you get these annual surveys that are published, you have to pull the information out, then you have to figure out a way to aggregate it, figure out a way to, you know, have somebody that can provide a score on it, probably benchmark that score against things like MSCI or other providers that are providing public scores. And that's where you start seeing the cracks, is that it's difficult for LPs to really know what the data means and how to use it in a way that supports their investment standards. So I think, you know, if we look about like data availability being scarce and difficult to validate unstructured data sources and limited analytics to help clients, I think that's where you have the challenge, and less so around GP's willingness, but just more the nature of how the data is coming in.
Yeah, and just kind of the way it's presented and what is required of them, I guess. Okay, I think we're coming to the end of our time, but I'm keen to answer one of the audience questions that have come in relation to ESG as well. So do let me know if you have an opinion. But so it's kind of when could we expect the integration of ESG into fund reporting? Carla, do you have any views on that? Is that something that I'm sure we'd like to see it come in, but do you think it will come in anytime soon?
It has to. So under the EU disclosure regs, the first piece of which goes live in 8 months' time, If you are a fund that is being marketed into the EU, or you're a certain type of fund, then you are caught by those regulations, irrespective whether you're an ESG fund. You have to show as part of your risk framework and your decision making that you either proactively decided to include something with ESG, and you need to talk through that in prospectuses and and KIDs, etc. Even if you're non-ESG, you have to evidence and disclose what type of risk measurements you took place to consider the risk that you were non-ESG within that asset class. So the regulations are there, and this goes back to my earlier point. It's not necessarily that the regulator sat down and said, let's start regulating areas of the PE market. They simply said, if an investor goes into a fund and it falls within certain criteria as to what a fund constitutes, then wherever it sits in the asset space, you need to disclose that information to that investor. So already we do have a regulatory imperative. But I also just want to pick up on the point that Melissa made, which I couldn't agree with more. The generational point keeps getting lost within ESG, insofar as there is, stats upon stats showing that Generation X and whatever alphabets you were in now are making values-based investment decisions. I've done it myself. I switched from British Gas to a different energy supplier because they said they invested in wind farms. In the pension space, when you back in the day had your parents paying into a pension, one job for 65 years, now the average job for a Generation Xer is 19 different places of work, potentially 19 different workplace pensions. When they start making their investment decisions, they're going to be opening up their pack on a pension scheme, and they're going to be trying to think, which one do I want to go into, where they see an illustrative example of this pension scheme has undertaken impact investing, has gone and done solar energy. That's going to drive an investment decision. So again, irrespective of what the regulations are, and they are coming into force, and the deadline is starting at 8 months' time, there's also the more retail sector deadline that the infrastructure and PE houses, those that get to the point where they can get that data, get it disclosed to a beneficiary and investment level, they're going to be the first winners in terms of grabbing new business and in terms of most commercializing the opportunity that ESG provides them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a nice way to summarize, really, in terms of the direction in which the asset class is moving. And as we have more and more generations of more active investors, funds are going to be under greater pressure to provide the information that those investors are looking for. Okay, all right, well, that brings us to the end of our session today. Thank you all for joining me, and thank you, speakers. It's been really great. I think we've had a really great discussion, and I will look forward to speaking to you again in the future. Thank you all for joining.